It's been nearly 20 years since the Chaos Sorcerer has gotten an update, which feels a little bit unfair. So to compensate for that, I decided to grab the new Librarian and Terminator Armor and turn him over into a Traitor's Heretic. To start things off, I got all my Chaos bits. In there, I found this torso that would be a perfect catalyst for the idea I was beginning to have. This is not the first piece that makes you think of a Chaos Sorcerer, however, I want to make something interesting and unique by honing in on the aesthetic of mutations provided by Chaos. Specifically on the one I enjoy that's quite general to them, that focuses on the way Space Marine armor is almost fused to them. This meant taking a massive leap of faith and making some very big cuts right away. With every chunk of the model flying away, I couldn't help but feel uncertain if I could make this work. But as I destroyed the vital piece of the Terminator armor, I knew I was going to make this work one way or another. For now, I focused on finding a good way to make the two pieces fit together. Having removed so much plastic, I decided to make an additional cut so I could stretch the piece of armor and make it easier for myself. With them looking close enough, I felt satisfied to move on. I took out the Librarian and removed all of the pieces that I thought would be necessary. First, I was just going to take the axe on the shoulder, but then I thought I'll take the whole hand. Oddly enough, there was a strange hole that made me think this wasn't always a push-to-fit model. On a side note, I think he actually looks even better with just regular Terminator arms. Borrowing his arm did accidentally break this piece though. For the legs, I changed my mind and opted in to use the regular Terminator ones. While originally I was going to use the Librarian legs, my idea was beginning to shift. After measuring the torso and the legs, it was quite clear that it was just a bit too tall. To make both of them fit, I'll have to remove a small piece at a time, but I have to be careful not to remove too much in one go. After some time, the two pieces weren't perfect, but they were close enough. Now, I just needed to figure out what head was going to go on this torso. The regular Terminator helmet was incredibly tempting, however, I had a eureka moment. This Age of Sigmar helmet looks like an updated version of the Sorcerer one. Unfortunately, attaching this head to this neck will make him look like a giraffe, so I have to remove it and figure out something else instead. Dry fitting the head to the neck area did not look as bad as I thought. With all the pieces prepped up and ready, it was time for me to face the dreadful moment I was waiting for. Green stuff. I've only used it several times and I'm absolutely terrible with it. But unfortunately, there was just simply no other way. So I started with the simplest piece I could think of and took out my tools. Coincidentally, I have no idea how to use them either. But it was definitely better than trying to use my fingers. And to my surprise, it wasn't turning out that bad. Attaching the head, I had a rough idea for how much neck I was going to have to build around it. While I knew that sculpting muscles was simply far beyond my skill, I had to rely on something else entirely. Which is that the general shape of the muscle I'll create and the way I'll paint it will hopefully make it look sufficient. Luckily for me, Chaos mutations can be quite erratic, so I didn't have to make anything perfect. But I still tried creating the representation of the muscle I was trying to make. While my anticipation was that this would be the easiest part, it became quite challenging when I had to go into some of the areas that were obstructed by different parts. But beside that, I thought I did a pretty decent job trying to meld the two pieces together with this horrible flesh. While I was nervous and skeptical at first, once I attached the legs, I was finally beginning to gain some confidence in this. With such a massive torso, I knew that I had to expand the arms at least a little bit. As with the neck, I mainly focused on creating the right shape rather than trying to sculpt the perfect muscle. The additional green stuff also made it quite easy to position this arm in any way I wanted to. For the second arm holding the axe, I added even more green stuff to it. Even with the lack of symmetry, I can still create the idea that there's some logic behind these mutations, with the arm wielding the axe having a lot more muscle to make it even more powerful when it swings. However, even with that, I still wanted to pose this axe in a way that shows that it has a lot of weight to it. Using the sculpting tool, I also did my best to smooth out the transition between the muscle of the chest and the arms connecting to it. The neck area felt like it was lacking a little bit in the thickness of it, so I added an additional piece. I began to notice that my green stuff was beginning to stiffen up. Because of that, it took a lot of additional effort to smooth out this piece and make sure that it doesn't stand out against the others. Because the entire model was being held together by green stuff, I didn't notice that all of my sculpting was moving the parts around. So I had to shape the pieces back in the original position, but unfortunately that generated some grooves that I first had to smooth out, this time trying my best not to move any of the pieces around. The model was looking far more impressive than I initially anticipated, and I thought of some additional details that I could possibly add to it. I took some of the additional green stuff I had left over and sculpted some different things. My favorite one turned out to be this piece of cloth, but unfortunately it was far too thin and fragile, so I had to remove it. I was worried that it would peel off during the painting process, so instead I just messed around for a bit more. I definitely regret this because after my green stuff dried out, I did try out some of this very thin stuff and it's just as strong as the rest of it, so I definitely could have kept it. And for the last modification, I removed this amulet and replaced it with something much more fitting of a Chaos Space Marine, a skull. I wasn't quite sure how I was going to approach the painting process, but I decided to prime the model in this very interesting purple. As my sorcerer is a follower of Tzeentch, I wanted to give him a blue armor that slightly resembles the Thousand Suns. At the same time, I wanted to create a lot more depth to this armor, so I started off with very dark colors. I couldn't quite decide on what texture I would use for his armor, so for now, I'll just paint his skin. Using Bugman Glow as my base, I mixed it with a lot of the purple I had on my palette. Chaos Corrupted skin tends to look very pale as well as has these very uncomfortable looking purple hues to it. So to build to that, I started off with just the purple on its own and then build up all the way to the Bugman Glow. To create a much more paler dead looking color, I added a lot of white to my Bugman Glow. For the texture, I went with a lot of these small little dots to have the idea that there's a lot of scar tissue on it. The surface of his skin will look like a massive tumor or a very horrible burn, rather than the normal soft looking skin you would see in a human. For the highlight, I chose to add a little bit of ice yellow instead to make it stand out and contrast against the purple of the original skin. But even with this highlight, there was still mainly a lot of purple in there. While normally I wouldn't jump to a brighter color so soon, when creating a very uncomfortable looking skin, I think it works perfectly. From now on, I'm only adding a tiny amount of ice yellow to my mix and not using any other colors. This will also make the highlight look a little bit more interesting than if I just used a cold white instead. The blue of the armor will look quite cold, so hopefully by providing some additional warm colors on the skin, I'll make it stand out a lot more. I finished off my skin by mainly providing a lot of these smooth lines. I also finally had the idea for how I was going to paint my armor. I took the royal blue color and applied it in a crescent shape. With this texture, I want to showcase that the magic is literally flowing in his armor. Then I used a little bit Thousand Suns blue to continue the exact same thing. For the armor, I did my best to always follow the crescent shape wherever I could. To make the transition between the color a lot smoother, I made sure to use a large amount of water in my mix. I did 2 layers, then progressively working to a pure saturated Thousand Suns blue. Next up, I mixed in a tiny amount of ice yellow, going over the exact same crescent shape, this time covering a little bit less texture. And the armor was quite literally beginning to look quite magical. There's also an added bonus that the color scheme is gonna match the Zangors that I paid many years ago. I continued working through several layers, each time adding in just a tiny amount of ice yellow. As I got progressively closer to my final highlight, I also began doing some edge highlighting. When I was done, I took black paint and covered up all of the areas that were not the armor. I mainly did that because at the time I wasn't quite certain what colors I was going to make the other pieces. This often helps me visualize each individual piece as a blank slate. But the visual of it was looking quite interesting, so I took some rubber black and began highlighting all those parts. Each time adding in a tiny amount of white to transition through my highlights. This was giving it almost an obsidian appearance, which contextually I also found quite interesting, as with the armor I was showcasing movement of the magic while the obsidian is quite the opposite. It was grounding down the model as well as creating a contrast in textures. I tried painting the blade once, but it didn't work out. So I decided to opt in for painting the eyes. I was previously asked how I got the bright red appearance, and it's simply using this red ink through an airbrush. Unfortunately, I didn't realize that the airbrush was positioned exactly above the head. For the blade, using dark sea blue as a base, then transitioning to the emerald. The blue of the armor as well as something about that helmet began reminding me of the Lich King from Warcraft, so I wanted to borrow an interesting idea from that. Where similar to Abaddon's weapon, it traps the souls of those it has slain in battle. With that, my sorcerer will be using them almost as a portable battery, empowering all of his horrible spells. To conceptualize that idea in the texture, I created these lines, to show that each one is a strand of a soul trapped inside of that axe. Repeating this texture with every single transition to a different highlight. each time adding in just a tiny amount of ice yellow to the pure emerald. The closer it got to the final highlight, the more I began adding some of these edge highlights, similar to what I did in the armor. I wanted to make the weapon even brighter, so for the final highlight I used pure ice yellow on its own to create some of these hot points. However, they were standing out a little bit too much, so with additional lines, it should hopefully balance them out. When painting the skull, unfortunately the contrast paint reactivated the white. So first, I had to correct this mistake. Skeletal Horde is usually my go-to when it comes to painting bones. This felt like an interesting exception, and trying something new is always good. It turned out not as bad as I thought, and I might try experimenting with this a bit more. To bring some additional details to the model, painting the cables in red. For the ornament of the weapon, the original idea was to go with gold, however black seemed like a much more appropriate choice for this. Finally, when it came to the base, not wanting to use the old one, this alternative seemed like a very good fit. And with the final steps, the model was finally done. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. This was a really fun kit bash. Consider joining the Patreon, but for now, I'll see you next time.